So, hello everybody. Today is going to be another review day where I'm going to review another role-playing product. This time I'm going to review Threefold by Green Ronin Press. Threefold is the first original setting to be released for the Modern Age game by Green Ronin. Um, Since Threefold was released several years ago, they've also released other products for the modern age basic rulebook, as it were, but they're all based on IP from other areas. So this is the first one that they produced that was genuinely and only made by Green Ronin themselves. Now, what is Threefold? Threefold is at its core a setting which allows for the idea that there isn't just one Earth, but alternate Earths, but also not just one plane, but many planes. Now, we have this in various genres. We've got this in the science fiction, but we also have this in the fantasy genre. So, for example, Dungeons and Dragons has always talked about the multiverse, that there are plenty of different planes, and people have been able to play in them. So, for example, Dark Sun would be a different plane than, let's say, the Forgotten Realms, Sword Coast, Faerun. Then, of course, you would have Greyhawk, which again is a different plane of existence, a different type of universe, and so on and so forth. You've got the Dragonlance world, Kryn, which again is different from all of the other ones, and they're not just on the same planet, and you can just travel from one, let's say, continent to another, and then you're suddenly in Dark Sun, or in the Dark Sun setting, and then you're back in Faerun. But it's actually different planes that coexist, possibly synchronously, possibly not, depending on how you view things. But it's the idea that there is not just the one world, but that there are many worlds. And the threefold setting actually is centered around this as well. And of course, you also have other role-playing, tabletop role-playing systems that play with this idea. So the German Midgard, for example, is definitely structured around this idea where you have different planes of existence that range from complete chaos to completely solidified elemental worlds, and kind of the world that we live in. In this case, it's a mid-fantasy based world. It's kind of in the middle, so it is kind of still in flux. It's not completely solidified, but it's also not entirely chaotic. And Threefold pretty much operates along the same lines. Unlike the idea of the multiverse, as I understand it in Dungeons and Dragons, Threefold actually aligns everything according to, and here I would like to point out, if you are going to be playing as a player in the Threefold campaign, please stop listening now because I'm going to spoil some of the tenets which the Threefold design team have put out there as truths. So there are certain areas in the book where all of the information is prefaced by the sentence, "This is the truth." So if you are listening to this and you're going to play, just stop listening now because I will be spoiling some of the information in those sections that are Game Master only. Having said this, as with anything that Green Ronin put out, they also tell you this is how we set up the whole, let's say, cosmos in this particular case, um, and how we are going to use it in this book, but also in other supplements that they have already produced, that or that they may still be coming out in future. And they will hold to these eternal truths. That doesn't mean that you as a game master cannot just dispense with these truths and come up with your own ones. But for the players, it would be good not now to stop listening because we don't want to spoil it. So essentially, I will start with the truth. And the truth is that there are three ions which are soulless. And I don't want to call them creatures, but there is no term that would explain them. They're not entities, they're not essences, they just are. And even they are probably not the originators and the generators in the Greek sense of the word of Genesis, creators of the metacosm that Threefold is set in, or that makes up the threefold setting. So these three ions have been given names by the design team so that we have something to talk about. The first one is called, well, first in no particular order, we have Abraxas, we have Logos, and we have Nemesis. And each one of them is vying with the others to become or to be the victor at the end, the so-called Omega, when one of them is supposed to attain full godhood, complete godhood, whatever you want to call it, they become the god. The god. And due to the fact of the nature of the metacosm, this will mean that they will then have always been God and will always be God, because they will basically span time and retroactively have always been God and in future will always be God. So that's essentially the idea behind it. Now, this omega state, or whatever you want to call it, can only be attained by one of them. So there is no possibility of two or three, or even the three of them deciding to be a triumvirate, or two allying against one. It only has to be the one. And how do they attain this omega state? They do it by getting souls. And this is the second, in my opinion, most important tenet of the story, as far as I interpret it. And again, this is my interpretation of the story. There are sapient beings, they have souls. And this is what these three vie for. They need souls to power their struggle for supremacy and to gain the omega state. And they do it in different ways. So let's start with Abraxas, because he or she or they come first in the alphabet. Abraxas is, if you like, the god that runs mythology, that has created the myths that we on Earth still talk about. The Greek gods, the Norse gods, the Hindu gods, everybody, the Shinto gods, they are his, in a way, creation, while again we have also created them. So that's one of those things where we kind of go, okay, so gods exist because humans created them, or sapient beings created them. And you have these godlike creatures that feed Abraxas and stem from them. They are called the hierarchs. Then we have Logos, which is the, if you like, STEM version of a god. So it's the physics, the mathematics, the sciences that basically hold together Logos's reality. And they want to attain godhood by getting the sapiens to use their reason and the laws of nature to innovate. And lastly, you've got Nemesis. And Nemesis, and sorry, and the if you like, the gods that serve the Logos, if you can say that they serve them, are called the Machinors. And then lastly, we've got Nemesis. A nemesis is the all-consuming flame in a way. Nemesis gets the souls by torturing sapient beings and removing everything that isn't soul, everything that is kind of like rational abilities, and attains souls by creating eternal suffering. So they're, if you like, really evil. And their gods that serve it, or whatever you want to call it, are the Alastors. And these three, if you like, have, and here again we come up with the fact that human beings always want to order things in certain ways that we can grasp it. So this is basically, if you like, if you were to really dig into the threefold idea, then basically everything that I'm describing to you now, if it was true, it would be a human brain's take on reality. And basically then these three, and again we have the threefold, have three different worlds or types of worlds or planes that they govern. We have, let's start with the Logos because that's the easiest one because it's closest to home. Logos is or runs Earth, the prime line. So that's the Earth that we live in. That's the Earth that you're sitting in at the moment listening to this. And all its alts. Now, the Logos is trying to create a singularity. That's its final attainment as a godhood, Omega situation. Um, and then you have the Nemesis that's trying to create, if you like, an eternal hell for everybody. That's what their goal is. And then you have Abraxas who's trying to create a monomyth. So basically you have everything is completely mythologically combined in one big myth. And for this would be the expression of their various godhoods. And basically the Logos through the Machinors runs Earth in a way, or the Machinors try to run Earth in such a way that the Logos will at some point attain Omega. Um, and it's important to note that neither the Hierarchs nor the Alastors nor the Machinors get direction or orders from the Logos, the Nemesis, or Abraxas, depending on who you're talking to. They try, based on their very nature, they live in such a way or exist in such a way that they will eventually try to bring about their respective gods or entities, godhead and godhood. So anyway, Earth is the realm of the Machinors and Logos. So basically, Earth is the one plane and all its alts which is most stable with regard to all of its natural laws. So the natural laws in other planes, like the other worlds and the nether worlds, can vary. So Earth is, because it's driven and governed by natural laws, the least of the fantastical worlds in terms of that there is hardly any magic, certain sorts, types of magic, and I just call this magic in game terms, it's called powers, do not even exist on Earth unless you bring them to it by a being that is outside of Earth or has tapped into extra terrestrial, as it were, power sources and has been imbued with certain abilities that can, would be considered magic, but is in and of itself opposed to it. So there is a mechanic called incessance, which means that certain things are more difficult to achieve in certain planes simply because the plane's makeup doesn't really allow for these things. So essentially, Machinors and Logos are Earth, and the Machinors have created multiple Earths, they're so-called alts, where different things happen. They are concurrent or usually only 10 years into the future of the prime line, where different things have happened. So this is kind of the idea of there are multiple Earths, and every time a huge decision is made on Earth, a new reality is basically split off. So we all know this. This is something that quantum physics tells us as well, that the idea is that every time, even if you were to take it to the extreme, every time you make a decision, a new reality is spawned, and you live in this decision tree, but then there are other trees where yourself did not take that decision but went for something else. And basically, this is the idea of an ever branching earth. So this is not as extreme in that every single time a human being makes a decision, a new alt is spawned. But these alts are kind of created as testing grounds by the Machinors. They make a conscious decision to create an alt and see what happens, you know. And some of the alts are terrifying. There have been nuclear wars, or there have been terrible famines, or in some alts there may be the rise of the machines, you know, like the Terminator uh, story has come to fruition. So basically, that's not just an alternate future, but it's an alternate world, and you can travel to these if you so choose, or if you have the means of doing so. So that's, if you like, and being a human being and being Earth-centric, this is basically where I would like to start my storytelling of Threefold. So this is basically the, in my opinion, main storyline when I'm running this, from which I would branch out. Then you've got the Abraxas hierarch based worlds, where which are so-called other worlds, which are um, sometimes, in my opinion, probably a lot more high fantasy like. They are, there's a lot of magic in there. They are the myths. So you could, I mean, you could have an ancient Greek one. You could have like the so-called other world, as it is, let's say, designed by the Celtic fairy tales, and so on and so forth. So they are all um, quite magical. And then you've got the Nether Worlds, which are just terribly abyssal places, which are run by Alastors, and they are in a way also the most chaotic ones, because an Alastor is basically an expression of the Nemesis. So like a god that is spawned by the Nemesis in a way, and their planes are simply held together by an Alastor's will. Alastors are hugely powerful. They are gods in their own right, if you like. You know, names are interchangeable here. And they have willed a plane to not just fall apart. And unfortunately, they are quite cruel beings in a way, because in order for the Nemesis to gain supremacy and attain Omega status, they need souls in their purest form. So souls that have no rational thought associated with them anymore, and are just pure essence. And the way to achieve this for the Nemesis is to torture them and torture the hell out of them until everything else is stripped away. Um, and that's how the planes of the nether worlds that are run by Alastors, or held together by Alastors, are, um, if you like, structured to bring about this eternal suffering. So this is, so think about hell. Any form of hell, fire, and damnation could be found there. And so this is the threefold structure of the metacosm, if you like. And the game itself is structured in such a way that you can, in theory and in practice, travel to any plane with your players. Your players can go anywhere by the means of gates. Um, and it is, there's a restriction imposed on how gates operate. Gates can be sealed. It's quite difficult, but it can be achieved. Gates can even be made, which is even more difficult, and which only very, very few beings are capable of doing. And even then, actually keeping this gate alive, as it were, is quite difficult. So essentially, gates exist. Sometimes gates open, sometimes gates close, for no apparent reason. That's also part and parcel of a storytelling device. Why is there a gate, or why was there a gate before and now it's gone, or things like that. So at the end of the day, what this game is about your characters um, becoming initiated into the knowledge that gate travel exists and that there is more than just the one plane. And starting on Earth, its prime line is an uninitiated world. So people on Earth, you and me, do not know that there are more than that there are other planes. They have no idea of what's going on there. They don't know what an other world is. They don't know what a nether world is, and they certainly cannot travel there. And Earth, like I said, is logos based, and the logos also and the Machinors don't want Earthlings to know about this. So they have created a group called Peridexion, which is, if you like, operants and a whole complex bureaucratic group that tries to hide this from Earthlings, this fact. They are fully knowledgeable that planes exist, that Earth is just one of them. They also know about the alts, and they can travel between the alts using quantum mechanics. There are hardly any gates that are created between one Earth and an alt, or the prime line and an alt, or different alts. So basically, you have to use different methods of travel. And then there is another um, plane spanning group called the Vitane. The Vitane is essentially a little bit like the Federation in Star Trek. They have very, very set rules. One of them is that they foster democracy. The other one is that sapient life has to be cherished in all its forms, and you cannot harm a sapient. You have to safeguard all sapients. They will not interfere with worlds that are uninitiated, so they will not just bring information about gate travel and about planes to worlds where this information doesn't exist. They have a hands-off approach. It's like the fifth directive in Star Trek, but they are interested in exploration, and that's what they do. And then you have the Divine Empire, which split off from the Vitani at some point and set up their own story line. And they are basically run by so-called optimates. And optimates are the sons and daughters, or the offspring of hierarchs, i.e. the gods of Abraxas that have mated with humans. So, for example, Hercules would be, all of the offspring of Zeus would essentially be optimates. So it's a little bit like the Scion RPG in the idea that there are human beings that have like one divine parent, as it were. Then you've got the Night Host, which essentially is the remnants of a huge army of the Nether Worlds that basically decided to rebel against their Alastor masters and went off and did their own thing. And they are, even by name, and when you look at the structure and the names that are used for their hierarchies in Threefold, are essentially a group of warriors that are bound to a Thane. And this Thane basically is of the best warrior they have. You can challenge them and so on and so forth. And if you basically pass the challenge and kill them in battle, then you can take over. But it's like a Viking inspired group of people, and they have war bands, and then they can form bigger war bands, and they don't really form nations as such, but they basically form extended clans that center around combat, but not just combat for combat's sake, but they are descendants of military, of soldiers, and they really live in very hostile environments where, unfortunately, in order to survive, they have to fight. So that's what they are centered on and fighting and being able to hold your own and hold your ground and also prevent harm from coming to your immediate family and immediate war host, is what drives them, and that's what they also strive for. So they are soldiers at the heart, and they live in a warband, soldier-like world, not unlike Sparta, although we do have the descendants of Sparta, the so-called Crypteia, actually in there. And I will not talk about them because there is just so much in this whole story that it would take me ages to narrate it all. But essentially, you have these three again areas. You have the Vitane, you have the and it's kind of like offspring, the Divine Empire. They're kind of in opposition, but not openly fighting. You've got the Nightost, and then you've got the Peridexion and its operative branch, the Ithon, that basically mainly interact with Earth and only on Earth. They don't necessarily go anywhere else. And within this, you can now basically in the threefold rule set create your own professions, etc. They are in there. You could also use them from the basic rulebook, from the Modern Age rulebook, and basically create player characters that operate in this particular metacosm. Now, you not only have professions and backgrounds like you're used to from the Modern Age rulebook, but you also get ancestries because of this whole idea of metacosmic planar travel. It is possible that other sentient beings kind of came to Earth and mingled and gave your player characters some of their traits. So you've got a couple of them. You've got the Arvu, the Dreigur, the Huldra, and the Jana or Jaina, and they all have particular traits that you can choose from and replace certain traits that you would get through professions or backgrounds and use them instead. You also have a couple of new talents that come with this particular setting. But I would say that from a crunch perspective, this book is very light on the crunch in terms of there are just a couple of supplements to the already existing Modern Age book. And you don't really need to use them. You could play with normal people from the basic rule book and still put them into the sodality or into the Ithon. And basically, this is also where I would like to uh, kind of talk about how the setting informs the play style or how the setting informs what you can play as. Because mostly you would be playing either as an Ithon or as a sodality member or let's say an associate of one of these groups. Because although in theory you have 1,000 planes and more to choose from, and you can make up your own, and it's not a problem at all, and there is a way to make them and to create them. I would assume that most people will actually start closer to home and possibly start their adventure on Earth or their arcs on Earth and create humans, maybe with extra human ancestry, but that's also not important. You don't have to do this. You can be a completely viable character in this setting without having Arvu or Jaina or whatever ancestry. No problem at all. But usually people will probably start at home because that's what they know. And you could easily never ever leave Earth and not even go to any of the outside of the prime line and still play threefold. There are very many ways in which you can bring the planes onto Earth, and then your sodality or Ithon operatives try to make sure that Earth is protected. Because while the Ithons will eliminate anything that is an extraterrestrial threat and will modify people's memories, so they're kind of like a little bit like the Men in Black in that that they will basically remove your memories if you've seen something that shouldn't be seen. But even the sodality, which is the, if you like, the operative side and branch of the Vitane, seeing as Earth is an uninitiated plane, would take great pains to eliminating any incursions from outside because Earth is not supposed to know. Earth's rulers have decided that Earth is not supposed to know. Earth is an uninitiated plane, and the Vitani will keep it that way. That's one of their tenets as well. So the Vitani does have its outposts on Earth because the Vitani has outposts in most planes. Um, but it works undercover, just like the Ithon works undercover. So you could have all kinds of things happening here. You could have intrigue between the Ithon and the sodality. You could have a rogue Ithon guy trying to basically inform people of what's going on. You have factions that are set in the prime line that are um, explained to a great level of detail in this particular setting book that will allow you to play all kinds of stories, like from crime, noir, spy, but also intrigue, and but even fantasy, cyborg, whatever you name it, cyberpunk in this world on Earth without ever leaving. Which also brings me to the next thing that I really like about this setting. As I was reading the book, I could already see many other role playing books that I own that you could easily take and drop into this. So, for example, when we talk about the Nether Worlds, why not take descent into Avernus, because Avernus is a hell, and that's from D&D 5th edition. You could just take this as your description of a hellish plane and then put people in there. You have your description. You don't have to come up with it. You could even have like the storyline that's unfolding in Descent into Avernus and just basically put it in there and have your players experience Descent into Avernus, that's which is a D&D 5th edition, and just put your players in there. It's not a problem at all. You could also take something from, let's say, Shadowrun and put it in there. You could even set it in on Earth, not a problem, because Shadowrun, of course, is set on Earth, and you could have this as a prime line or as an alt experience happening. You could also take your inspiration from a book series called The Invisible Library, because The Invisible Library itself deals with the idea that there are multiple planes and that you can travel between them, and that the library is the place where all of the information is stored. It's a huge archive. You could totally use this because there even is mention of a very large library which is on Vigris, which is the Vitane capital plane, where, for example, sodality members go to train. So you could also say, okay, you have somebody uninitiated on Earth suddenly meet an extra planar thing, whatever that is. It could be a being, it could be some kind of resonance from another plane, and then they become initiated in a way by sheer, accident. But it cannot be unseen because maybe their inheritance, their heritage, maybe their Jaina or Avu, Drygor or Huldra suddenly comes into stark focus. And then maybe the Vitane decide, and together with the Itheon, oh, we are not actually going to eliminate their knowledge from them, but we're going to try and recruit them. So the Ithon could try and recruit them, and the sodality could try and recruit them. And if they decide to go with a sodality, then they are spirited away to Vigris, where they will go undergo training. You could have, there's a college there which you could base on any kind of college. It could be that there will be the possibility of doing occult training. There will be the possibility of doing physical training. So you could have your really basic um, first level characters, and then you send them there, and then they get to pick maybe one or two more talents if they are more interested in fighting, if they're more interested in the occult or into into other things. You could then go through a series of training episodes with them. So there is all kinds of things that you can do here that are based in this using the normal age system. Here we come to the system. It is your normal age system. You have your 3d6s, the differently colored stunt die. You have stunts that are in there. You use the basic rulebook stunts, etc. There are a couple of new weapons in there, or also a couple of new uh, other things like mm, gadgets, but some of them are also magical gadgets as well. But other than that, this is really not so much, like I said, crunch. It's really story driven. It's a setting. The whole thing is rounded off with a small first level adventure where you will actually also do some gate travel, and where you will then try and solve a very ethical dilemma, in my opinion. And this brings me to something that I have perceived throughout the age books that I have read. There are a couple of things that I would like to point out. Number one, Green Ronin, without overtly saying so and being in your face, is very inclusive. And I would like to point this out. You can find it in the description, but also in the art. Um, and in the way characters are described, but also the relationship between characters is described. So if you are looking for an inclusive experience, I would say you can go with any of the age based rule books, as well as story books, as well as settings. They are all inclusive, and they don't just basically go around and tell everybody, hey, we're inclusive. They just are. They also, in this particular case, which I really enjoy, have taken great pains to research um, uh, concepts thoroughly. So, for example, they introduced the crypteia, which is a plane spanning, um, very, very to moderately evil to chaotic neutral, shall we say, organization, which is based off of the crypteia, which was in ancient Sparta a secret society of the best um, warriors of an age cohort. They were told to go into hiding and terrorize the helots by, random killing and really terrorizing them. And they had to do this in complete secret. They were not allowed to expose themselves. They did it well. Kryptos, of course, means hidden in a way. And they've basically researched this, and they give a brief description of what the Crypteia did in ancient Sparta, and it's spot on. I was very impressed. And then they used this concept and said, well, it has developed over thousands of years on the Prime line and alt Earths, and this is what it's like today. And I really like this. I also like the fact that they have, for example, that one of the three great powers that's trying to vie for the Omega state, or is vying for the Omega state, is called Logos. And of course, here we've got a reference to the to en arche en ho logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And I think this is just such a nice way of grounding this setting in our world the way it is supposed to be. So this is an uninitiated person finding this information and reading through it and so on and so forth, and harking back to things that we know, but then giving them this extra twist. And this is what me and my partner in crime, when we're talking about, playing um, in a reality setting, like this is kind of a lot more real than, let's say, Dungeons and Dragons, where you have like high fantasy from the get-go, but it's a reality, and then you have like a twist by half a degree um, on the compass, and then it's not your reality, but it's slightly skewed, and that's where the fantasy element comes in. And I really like how they've done it, and I always appreciate it when they go for a twist on reality, but underpin it with really good research of what it is based off of. Um, there is some art in the book, but it's few and far between because, of course, we all know that art is very expensive, and rightly so, because we have artists that actually spend a lot of time training and then, hopefully get contracted and commissioned. Um, I would say that the character creation process is a combination of this book and, of course, the basic rulebook. You cannot use this book on its own. You need the basic rulebook. I would also recommend that you get the companion because it's referenced, and you also need the allies and enemies book because it's also referenced and it is required. Um, Building a character or creating a character in the age system, in the modern age system, but also in Fantasy Age First Edition, I find the descriptions could have been a little clearer and a little more structured. So you will spend some time on this, and it's going to there will be a couple of question marks around certain things, but nothing that can't be overcome. And of course, if you are really stuck, or if you say, well, I don't want to engage with this at all, you can use the completely randomized system that the age books come with. You just roll on tables, and then your character gets essentially created for you randomly. And you will get viable characters this way. Don't worry about it. Characters will be viable and playable. If they then suit your playstyle, or if they then suit your concept, that's a different question. But if you say, I don't want to engage with this, you can actually just do it randomly, or you sit down, you create character concepts with your players and the GM, and then you go through the books and basically assemble them. Like the modern age game, you can play Threefold in the three different modes: gritty, pulpy, and cinematic. But of course, the point is that they even say you could mix them, because depending on the plane that you are in, some might be more gritty, some might be more cinematic, some might be pulpy in the middle. You have all of these options, and this is also where I really think those world or plane spanning scenarios really shine. You have the possibility of changing up the story. You can put your players into a high fantasy world, not a problem. It's another world that is maybe like the Sword Coast, or Midgard. Well, Midgard is kind of like low fantasy, but let's say um, a Pathfinder world, Golarion. You could totally use these and put your characters into them, and then think about, what does this mean for a 21st century human, regardless of what their ancestry may be, and they're suddenly put in there. How does this work? And of course, there is some hand waving of things like, when you are a member of the sodality, you get like a little device that basically cloaks you in such a way that people in another world will perceive you not as human beings, but maybe whatever is normal there. They allow you to communicate in a universal language. They're like a universal translator that they have in Star Trek, basically to overcome the issue that if you go to a different plane, you may not be able to converse with anybody because you don't understand their language. So this is basically hand waved away using a little gadget, which I think is great, because it means you're not burdened with this, and you can concentrate on the story. And again, the story can be as story driven or as character driven, or a mix of both, as you like. You can bring in the ions as like these big things in the background. You can leave them out completely. You could also divulge knowledge of them, because in the story setting, it tells you that only very, very, very few people know that the ions actually exist, and even they have trouble really conceiving of what they are. And even like, the ions are and are not, because they can be unmade. And in a way, we made them, but we also didn't. So it's one of those eternal kind of like Ouroboros kind of ideas, like, you've got this snake that bites itself um in its tail, and it kind of is constantly going round and round. So there is no beginning, there is no end, although the end is the omega state, which will then hark back to the beginning, and then whatever entity arrives at the omega state and ends up winning will then basically retroactively always have won, will always have been the god. And so that's in a way how this story unfolds. There is also very concrete storytelling. There has been a fell war which has led to certain things changing, and certain in this, which is now called the third age, with the fourth age dawning, certain statuses that are now set, but that don't have to be set forever, because the fourth age is dawning. So we may be at the end of the third age and things may be changing. So as and when you and your players are exploring the threefold metacosm, you may come up with things, or they may come up with things that actually precipitate change. And that's what I really like about it, because this setting is inherently fluid. Which brings me to my conclusion. Would I recommend this? And I would say yes. And if you then also get the companion book, which is a series of adventures set in Threefold, I think even if you're afraid that you may be overwhelmed with choice and things that you could do and ways in which you can challenge your players, you don't need to be, because you can be as mundane and at home as you would like to be, and as out there as you would love to be. Really, sky is the limit. You can take whatever movies you've watched, whatever other role-playing games you've read, settings you've read, adventures you've read. You can all drop them in there and they would all be viable. And you can also use this as a trial ground, because if you drop something into it and your players don't respond to it, you can just move out and just put them into someplace else. And that is, in a way, a really nice way of doing it. So you can play it episodically, or you can play it with a grand arc. You can play it epically. You can have one epic backdrop and then basically have little episodes around it that basically, openly or not so openly, move towards a final confrontation with whatever you want. You can have them confront a god. You can have them confront something a lot less epic. But it is completely open, and it gives you enough guidance and enough of guardrails to not have to go overboard and not be completely at a loss, but also it leaves it open to you. And they also touch on time travel, and they say that time travel is actually not possible, except maybe perhaps on one of the other alts, but they highly discourage it because it leads to all kinds of issues. That doesn't mean that you cannot go back in time. You could go to an Earth that is um, at a different state of development, a Renaissance Earth alt. That's all possible. In a way, that's time travel in terms of you go back in time, but since you're in a different alt from the prime, you will not actually affect timelines. So that's also a way of saying, oh, I would really like to know what Europe during the Dark Ages was like. Well, there's an alt that emulates this and you can go there. So that's all from me. I would definitely recommend this if you are interested in modern game, but speculative fantasy, as this genre is called. You can get this in Europe through Drive-Through RPG as a PDF, and then of course what I did was I got the PDF and I basically then went and gave it to a printer so that I have a hard copy, because I like reading books. I hate reading PDFs. So that's Threefold for Modern Age. It's the original setting by Green Ronin for Modern Age, and it's a definite buy recommendation from me. Talk to you soon. Bye.